Freedom from violence is essential to the development of man's reason and personality. Welcome to Keith Knight, Don't Tread on Anyone. Today we have Sal the Agorist of saltheagorist.com. Check out his podcast. We're going to be going over an Agorist primer by Samuel Edward Konkin III. Sal, how are you, brother?
What's up, my man? How are you? Thanks for having me on again.
I'm doing fine, thank you. Just so we're on the same page, what is Agorism?
Well, agorism is, in my own words, it's the use of free market economics to subvert or undermine the state. I think we're going to go over somebody who knows a little bit more about it than I do, Samuel Edward Konkin. We'll go over what he thought about it, which I think he had maybe a little bit broader of a definition than I do.
On page 17, he goes over some economic concepts. Praxeology is the study of human action, and catalactics is the area of human action dealing with exchanges between acting humans. What are some of the economic concepts you've really embraced as an agorist yourself that show you the value of actually learning economics?
Well, I think you just hit the nail on the head. Really, because one of the things I learned from Walter Block, who's one of the people who's really influenced my thinking, is that praxeology and economics are the same thing. They're just synonyms, really. And Konkin, in the primer, actually, that we're going to speak about now, he does a great job showing how counter economics is derived from first principles, from praxeology. So it's sort of, he almost describes it in a scientific manner, and he shows how from praxeology, the inevitable conclusion is counter economics. So I would say praxeology probably, and just basic logic.
Sure. And when you look at an idea like catalactics, the area of human action dealing with exchanges between acting humans, well, if you think the economy is GDP and the unemployment rate and the stock market and things that don't apply to you, well, of course, as something like agorism isn't going to be of any value. But when you actually see that it's exchanging value for value, then you're like, okay, well, if I cut out this involuntary middleman called Uncle Sam, we could increase our profits, and we don't have to go through the regulatory hoops.
Yeah, and right now, I think a lot of those people, especially like the stock market folks, they don't see an avenue for agorism or counter economics. But I think that in the future, in the very near future, the blockchain and specifically the tokenization of securities and assets is going to sort of expand counter economics into their arenas.
Absolutely. I'm crossing my fingers. Later on page 17, he says, Agorism is the consistent integration of libertarian theory with counter-economic practice. An agorist is one who acts consistently for freedom and in freedom. So maybe I hear this and I say, well, I like the ideas of freedom and such, but agorism imposes a large amount of risk on me. I'd rather just sort of go with the flow and maybe promote the ideas until they're embraced on a large scale. Why should someone with that idea embrace agorism?
Well, it's like that's akin to sort of being a slave on the plantation who just tells everybody, yeah, we should be free, but you're still a slave. You're, at the end of the day, you're still a slave. So you can either embrace counter economics or you can live as a slave to the state. And that's really the choice. That's the beautiful thing about agorism, is that it offers instantaneous liberation to the individual. Once you accept the principles of agorism and you accept the idea of living consistently with your values, the values of liberty, then I think there's really no other option but to become an agorist.
On page 19, he says economics is the study of relations between people involving goods and services. I know Hoppe would say economics is the study of scarcity with humans and their scarce time and their scarce efforts. On page 20, Konkin says uncoercive government is a contradiction in terms. What does that mean?
Well, see, Konkin lays out like a brilliant attack on the whole LP and everything like that. But I think when he speaks about the government being a sort of contradiction, stuff like that, you can't really have a state that's consistent with the non-aggression principle. By definition, the state must be violent, right? That's what it means. It's the monopoly on violence.
So isn't that interesting? People will so often say, well, Government is us organizing and coming together to achieve our social goals. But you could
Right.
apply that to my local Catholic school. People came together, built a place, traded it, and now there's people who go to school there and there's teachers. And it applies to the supermarket and it applies to you and I right now or whenever you engage in agorist activity. So, in other
Right.
words, the reason we're embracing agorism is to get rid of this group called the state. And what makes them bad is not the Democrats are currently in there or the Republicans are currently in there. It's that it's a group of people that initiates violence or claims the right to against peaceful people. Anything else on government that we should know about before going further?
No, I think you basically hit the nail on the head right there.
Page 21, he says, humans act to remove or reduce felt unease. Those which remove felt unease are values. Values are subjective, existing in the mind, belonging to the thinking subject rather than to the object of thought. Why is a subjective value important in understanding agorism?
Oh man, well it's basically it's key to understanding all of economics, all of human action. Um, Everything that we decide, right? I think the problem with Keynesianism or Marxism or any form of collectivism is that they take this for granted, right? They think that there is an objective value that can be placed on something like labor or resources, and that's when they start to distort the economy and create the need for agorism. So I think that that's really the fundamental key to understanding basic economics is that value is subjective. That's even something that you see among like the Chicago economists like Tom Sowell and Milton Friedman. That's not just akin to Austrian economics.
Now, I know that you are involved with 3D printers. You posted a website on your Twitter. What is the website where people can buy 3D printers?
3D printer go burr, BRRR.com. And they can and
What
you can buy them for cryptocurrency as well, preferred.
now? I know that I worked with one in college a little bit, um, but they have to have gotten better in like the last 8 years or 6 years. What have been some of like the coolest things you've made with a 3D printer? Something a way of acquiring goods essentially that allows you to do so without involving the state. It's a brilliant agorist mechanism.
Well, you can make all sorts of things, and you're right about the technology progressing so quickly. I mean, from where it was 5 years ago to where it's going to be in 5 years, and where it is today are three completely different types of technologies. We went from regular FDM printing to resin printing. Now we're going to move towards five-axis printing, and there's all sorts of different types of printers being developed. So I'm really excited about who knows what tomorrow is going to bring. But I think you touched on an interesting point when you mentioned how it relates to counter economics, because counter economics, and one of the points that Conkin makes in the primer towards the end of the book, I don't want to jump too far ahead on you, but he sort of breaks down the difference between vertical and horizontal counter economics. And vertical counter economics is all about the creation of local production facilities that bypass state regulations. And a 3D printer is a great example of this, right? It's almost like having a factory on your own desk, and there's no good or service that can be made with that, which the state can prohibit. So that's why I think it's such a great tool for counter economics.
Now, a lot of agorists talk about Bitcoin. How would you describe Bitcoin to someone who is completely unfamiliar with it?
Bitcoin is a peer-to-peer cash for anyone around the world to use. That's the way Satoshi Nakamoto defined it, and that's the definition that I continue to use. But again, going back to our idea of counter economics and the local production facility, that's what the blockchain miner is, right? And when you combine the vertical aspect of counter economics with horizontal counter economics, which is just peer-to-peer voluntary trade, like I said in my most recent podcast, it becomes a very powerful tool for disruption. And that's why Bitcoin has been so successful, because not only are people creating their own currency, but then they're trading it around with others for goods and services. And that's very difficult for the state to regulate.
Sure. I know Hans Hoppe would always talk about how it's so vital that the state conspires with the bankers to create a central bank so they could have a monopoly, a legal monopoly on the money supply. Why does not using Federal Reserve notes undermine the state?
Well, as an agorist, right, we sit back and I look at the enemy, the government, and I think to myself, the sort of the nexus of their operation is the banking cartel, right? If it wasn't for the banking cartel, they wouldn't be able to fund any of this nonsense. They wouldn't be able to fund the welfare state or the welfare dependency. They wouldn't be able to fund the warfare state or the famine in Yemen. So really, the central bank is sort of the headquarters of their operation. So then the question then becomes, how do we defeat them? Well, as an agorist, we have to offer a better product than them. That's how we do it in a manner that's consistent with the non-aggression principle. And what is their product? Well, it's exchange media, it's money, and in my mind, we have to look for a better product, a more efficient medium of exchange, something that can't be restricted or can't be inflated away at any whim. And that's why I tell everyone to use Bitcoin Cash, because it's such an efficient medium of exchange that's also pretty much uncensorable. And it really retains Satoshi's initial vision of having that sort of peer-to-peer utility that was so essential for Ross Ulbricht when he created the Silk Road.
Now, in order to sort of justify current regimes, they will sort of change the way that they describe themselves. So they can come up with 50 different terms of why it's okay to initiate violence against peaceful people. So Konkin makes sure that we have a working definition of what Agora, meaning an open marketplace, would consist of as far as free exchange goes. He says, free means the absence of coercion. So when the Young Turks say libertarians are idiots, they think people they're voluntarists, some of them. So they just think people are going to volunteer for everything and you don't need money or anything. And it's like, yeah, it does sound stupid when you actively lie about it and conspire against us. So that's a good point. But that's not what we're talking about. We simply mean free means absence of coercion. Coercion is threatening violence upon someone in order to make him surrender something. In a strictly value-free sense, then coercive human action offers to create a greater disvalue to you if you do not yield up your lesser value. So it's like we see this with we see this almost perfect complementary moral and economic concept. If I am forcing you to do something against your will, I am decreasing your utility, making it a non-economic productive exchange. Any final thoughts on coercion and freedom and mutually beneficial exchange?
Yeah, well, notice how you brought up the example earlier of like the stockbroker and how there's sort of absence of counter economic opportunities for some people. And I think that's a lot of the reason why is because the state imposes such a high penalty for some of these people that it becomes they're sort of economically disincentivized to behave in an agorist fashion. But notice though how the difference between coercion and non-coercion is the difference between politics and the economy, right? Politics necessarily includes violence, whereas the economy, taken on its own, is free of coercion. So to me, like that's an important dichotomy to make, is politics versus anti-politics, or the market versus the state.
It's nice that people sort of embrace freedom in things they're used to being free in, but they sort of justify the state initiating aggression in things that are also just used to that happening. And so they're like, well, there's an FDA coercively regulating voluntary exchanges. Oh, thank God. Also, thank God I could listen to any podcast I want, and I could post a podcast, and I could make any video and publish it to Library and Odyssey. Because, I mean, imagine if I had to jump through hoops, I probably wouldn't even do it. Well, that's the same thing. That's why you get less production than you otherwise would in healthcare when you have certificate of need laws. You need the permission of potential competitors and, OSHA to get anything done. Well, of course, you raise the cost, fewer people will consume. If you raise the cost of doing business, fewer people will be in business. There will be fewer products, fewer services. We'll have less options. There will be less competition. We'll have higher prices. The poor will be worse off. They just never apply this. He says on page 30, repeated application of coercion destroys value. It's right there. It's right freaking there. He then talks about ways to protect yourself, even in the absence of a state. So you're an agorist, not exactly making sure OSHA is, regulating what you're doing. How can you protect yourself if you can't call the police? Well, he says locks, alarms, guns, knives, fences, insurance policies, insurance policies in a free society. What are some other ways who embrace agorism can make sure that I am free from not only state aggression, but maybe the local mob or mafia?
Great question. So there's a lot to be said here. The primary key, the key to understanding this, and the tool that I recommend for Agorist the most is end-to-end encryption. This is the strongest form of encryption that we have available to us today. And I think operational security, you and I were speaking a little bit about this before we went on. Operational security is really key to counter economics. This is how you're going to minimize your risk. And this is something that Konkin speaks about in the primer and also in the manifestos, minimizing risk to get your prices down. So OPSEC is key, and I think the way to do it is through end-to-end encryption. Some good tools for that. Obviously, everyone's using Signal right now. I don't even think they can handle the amount of activity that they've been getting recently. Have you seen that? They've been down. Some other good ways to use end-to-end encryption are one proton mail address to another proton mail address, one iMessage to another iMessage, but you have to make sure neither party is backing up their into the iCloud. Or a Telegram secret chat will use end-to-end encryption. But really the best one is Signal. That's because everything is encrypted. Also use Monero for black market transactions, because that again uses really strong forms of encryption. Monero is going to encrypt the sender's address, the recipient's address, and the amount of the transaction, which makes it very difficult for the feds to track. So encryption is key. But I think there's something else missing here. And this is something that I really haven't spoken about publicly yet. But one of the things Konkin says is create a new libertarian alliance, which he calls an association of Agorist entrepreneurs. And, he says that this should be done initially to sort of with the goal of minimizing risk for other Agorists. And I sort of had it in my brain lately that I think one of the projects we're going to undertake in 2021 is to formally create a nonprofit known as a New Libertarian Alliance, where we can it'll basically with the idea that we're going to start out as a sort of bail fund for victims of the state, people who have been aggressed upon by politicians. We can sort of offer to help them pay legal fees or to bail them out of prison or something like that. And then, hopefully we can, we'll have the goal of progressing later on towards, different realms of the counter economy. So that's a couple of things I would say. Use end-to-end encryption, be cognizant of OPSEC, and hopefully in the future we'll have a formal alliance that can sort of help minimize risk as well.
Sure. Before I forget, I really try and make sure to plug my alt media accounts, such as my big ones. I know if I list all 10, you're going to go to 0. So my 2 are my replacement for Twitter, if I get taken down, is minds.com, which you can find in the description, and Library Odyssey, lbry.tv, and Odyssey, odyssee.com. I got all my YouTube channel backed up there for people to check it out. If you get taken down on Twitter and I don't know if you're on YouTube, if you get taken down, where can people find you or subscribe just so they have a backup in case?
I'm on every social media platform, really. I'm probably the ones that I'm most active on, besides for Twitter, are probably Minds and MeWe. MeWe is a little bit easier for me to post memes like in rapid fire than Minds is, but I like Minds because as you know, everybody who listens to me knows I'm a huge proponent of tokenization, and Minds is utilizing that concept. Has tokenized content where the user is rewarded for their content, not Mark Zuckerberg or Jack. It's the content creators that are rewarded. So I'm on Minds, I'm on MeWe, I'm on Insta, Snap, I'm on all of them. But the main ones, other than Twitter and Facebook, would probably be Minds and MeWe.
Yeah, Library and Odyssey are also great. The CEO, Jeremy Kauffman, was posting how much he loves the work of Tom Woods, so he's a definite ally. And
Oh
then,
wow!
Alex Jones and Tim Pool got taken down. And I said, "Hey, for those who missed it, it's available on Library." And then Library saw it and gave me like 100 Library coins for their token
Very
process.
cool.
So they're a really friendly place that I would appreciate if people subscribe to, because I'm terrified of getting taken down. Another one of my videos got censored the other day. Age restriction. Absolute nonsense. Totally appropriate. Whatever.
But
Page
now,
32. Sorry. I'm sorry. What?
Sorry about that. Library and Odyssey, just to clarify, those are only video platforms, right?
They're video and PDF. And that's one of the great things, because I have found so many PDFs on there that have saved me time. Because sometimes I can't read the whole book, but I just want to control F to find, Iran-Contra affair that was written about,
Right.
When Kissinger was in Years of Upheaval.
Gotcha.
I'm not giving that bastard a sale. Page 32, Konkin says, he discusses competition versus monopoly, cartels, and oligopolies. So maybe I'm sort of interested in the idea of people being free and there being this agora, this open marketplace, but some people are smarter than others. In the same way, some people are great singers like Adele, but few people are. In the same way, when people trade, some people are way better than others. This will lead to a concentration of power, totally unequal society, giving people total control over the amount of resources and products available. Then they'll have so much leverage they could just jack up the price, and we're basically all at their whim. We're all screwed. But how do you respond to this claim that agorism is not something desirable because it will lead to oligopolies, cartels, and monopolies?
Well, in a free market, a monopoly really isn't possible, right? I mean, in the example that you gave, if let's assume someone had a monopoly on whatever particular industry and they decided they're going to jack prices up, well, then some other entrepreneur is going to come in and sense market opportunity, and they're going to think to themselves, "Hey, I could offer that same product at a much lower price or a better quality, maybe." And they're going to start to leech off and create and steal some of your market share, and at that point, your monopoly is broken. And that's really one of the keys about agorism. Is one of the great ways to do is to sort of disrupt these monopolies. Really, Konkin's not describing that here. What he's doing here is he's sort of laying an economic foundation to sort of lay into agorism. But it really is a great way for people to get involved in agorism. The next section, I don't want to jump ahead, but the next section on cartels is it's a closely related concept. It's basically a government grant of monopoly privileges to a group of individuals rather than one. And some of the original Agorists, and I don't know if Konkin says it here or somewhere else, but he speaks about this. Some of the original Agorists were these cartel busters, right? So in other words, you would have a group of railroad tycoons come together, and rather than compete with one another, they say, we're all going to agree to the same price. And we're only going to enforce ticket prices at such and such a price. But the problem is, one member of the cartel is going to get greedy, and they're going to sense that they can steal market share by lowering their prices to market value. So then the cartel goes to some politician and they say, "Hey, will you promise to shoot someone here who doesn't abide by the cartel's agreement? And if they bribe the senator or the congressman with enough campaign donations, they can get them to agree to do that." And that's how cartels are formed. And that's another great way that people can get involved in agorism, is by disrupting these cartels. And that's exactly what Bitcoin is doing.
Exactly. It's amazing to see that this is just such an awakening moment where Milton Friedman was asked, "You have so many good arguments. Why hasn't this been embraced?" And he said, "Mostly academia and big business." And that is so mind blowing. It's like, but aren't the big business guys for total freedom so they could screw us all? The reality is that business has so often gone to the state to stomp out competition. The big examples are Citigroup pushing Barack Obama for president and then emailing him who needs to be in his cabinet, which was released by WikiLeaks. There was how about the Federal Reserve, the biggest banking regulation ever, was written by the six wealthiest bankers at the time under the guise of we need regulation from panics. And then there's a Great Depression, and no one really cared to mention that. Frederick
There's no
Engels.
shortage of examples.
Yeah, Frederick Engels, the funder of Marx and the Communist Manifesto, major financier. Jacob Schiff funding the Bolshevik Revolution. The minimum wage pushed by H. Lee Scott and Doug McMullen, CEOs of Walmart, and Jeff Bezos coming out in favor of the minimum wage to stomp out his competition. The reason I mention that is because it's so vitally important to make sure you're not just picking a side to screw it to your opposition. I have sometimes hated the right so much that I'll just blindly defend the left and vice versa. So if you're just like, well, I'm against the big guys, and if they want any sort of freedom, I'll just be on the opposite. Don't let your opposition determine what your actual values are. Have independent justifications. On page 35, Konkin says, capitalism, ideology of capital or capitalists. Capitalists were trying to use the state to destroy the market. So you have to understand these principles, because maybe someone will use capitalism as the term, like I so often do, just because I want to concede that ground and start talking about principles. But I'll sometimes, give it to them. But if you have a general understanding, then you're not going to really conflict with other agorists or freedom advocates, so long as you're able to define your terms, as Konkin did earlier with his definition of free. Any comments on cartels, capitalism, or the market?
Yeah, so I think it's interesting what you said about capitalism, because so much of the people's disagreements nowadays comes down to a matter of definitions. And really, that's what Konkin is talking about here, right? He's using a different definition of capitalism. And I think right after the part that you quoted, he goes on to say, before Marx came along, the pure free marketeer Thomas Hodgkin had already used the term capitalism as a pejorative. Capitalists were trying to use coercion, the state, to restrict the market. Capitalism, then, he goes on to say, does not describe a free market, but a form of statism. And that's really the main difference. Ayn Rand later tried to use the term capitalism in a more positive tone. I'm not so keen on submitting I'm not so keen on giving the left our vocabulary, because if you've noticed, the state will do that a lot. They try to co-opt our terms. They're even doing it right now with the term Karen. Right? We see that happening today. They're trying to tell people, it was started as a meme to describe people who are pro-mask, and now they're trying to turn it into anti-mask. They did the same thing with the Tea Party, right? It went from pure free market libertarian, leave me alone, to Republican neocon. So the state will try to co-opt these terms as they gain popularity. That's why I'm not as keen to sort of give them up as Konkin was.
Exactly.
But I get where he's coming from.
Correct. If you understand your definitions, you're not going to get manipulated. I mean, that's why,
Right.
we have no problem seeing a group of people like Winco is a place in Arizona where the employees that work there own the entire facility. Now, you and I are curious whether or not is it voluntary and done through agreements and voluntary contracts? If so, well, then that's fine. Whereas Richard Wolff will say, aha, told you, socialism works. You must hate, this must piss you off and keep you up at night. I go, I couldn't be happier for them. If they value a voice in the workplace more than maybe less risk in the investment realm that's taken on by an investor, that's fine. You understand definitions. You can't get manipulated. You're less likely to get manipulated.
That's one of the points Konkin makes in the primer. One of the things that he stresses, and one of the things that I think is really, really important, is the significance of consistency, and that's sort of another way of looking at what you're describing. Sorry, I just wanted to throw that in there.
Did you ever see Konkin was in a debate? It's video recorded, and he goes, he's using an extreme example, but he goes, if we just, don't really embrace this philosophy and do things we can, like tangible things we can do right now, well then we'll just have libertarians everywhere. You get arrested by the libertarian police officer for smuggling
Yeah,
drugs, and he brings you to the libertarian security guard who brings you to the libertarian electric chair. And then he
right,
just goes
right,
through all that. In other words, it's like we have to do what we can to be consistent in both thought and
exactly.
action. Uh, and that's why, business, it's not about making money. Here, he talks about entrepreneurship, page 36. Entrepreneurship is direction, the reins of the operation, deciding where to invest capital, when, how much, and how many workers to hire, and a bunch of other specific things, what to sell, in what quantity, when to reinvest, when to fire people. So all that comes up. But if you just see business as bosses or buildings or money managers or whatever, then you're going to get screwed because you're going to get caught up in defending the wrong people at the wrong time. I mean, you could easily just say, well, Boeing and Raytheon are private companies, so you can't, really you can't really criticize them. But it's not private that makes it. It's advocating the initiation of violence against peaceful people through the military-industrial complex with who they conspire. So there again, Konkin leads us to seeing things clearly. Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so entrepreneurship is really one of the most important concepts in agorism. It's one of the most underrated aspects of agorism, and it's something that Konkin stresses both in the primer and also in the manifesto. And that's because you can't separate counter economics from entrepreneurship. One of the things that I tell my audience a lot is that, not all entrepreneurship is agorist, but all agorism is entrepreneurial. It's one thing to grow your own food. It's another to grow your own food for the whole community and to trade it with them. And it's one thing to hodl Bitcoin. It's another to spend it with the community and to use it in exchanges for goods and services. So entrepreneurship is key. It's also a great way to break out of the state structure. People who are wage earners have a portion of their check automatically deducted from their earnings and given to the politicians. And the term for that is slavery, right? So entrepreneurship is sort of the Agorist answer to what we think of as wage slavery. And this is something that ANCAPs give us a lot of help for. But I think that's because they don't really understand what we mean by the term wage slavery. Like I said, they automatically take a portion of your earnings. In the antebellum South, the plantation owner took 100% of your earnings, whereas, the modern day DNC takes 60%. So are you really that much more free?
Well, also, I mean, it could be said that a father works very hard and his family takes the money. But again, it's voluntary. It's something that he prearranged. The state said,
Exactly.
give us this amount so we could fund a mass murder campaign based on lies, or we'll put you in a cage and shoot you if you resist. We'll separate you from your children. It
Yeah.
is something you'd think more people would be interested in, but I'm like, hey, they're separating him from his children for not chipping into the schooling system, which is explicitly used to make people into total obedient idiots. And they're like, look, the law's the law. Kamala Harris is a great VP, even though she was involved in all this family separation for government schools.
Well, another way to look at it too, and you're right too. I agree with all of that. But from from the perspective of Austrian economics, the entrepreneur is really the motor of the economy. It's the entrepreneur who allocates resources in a free market. They're the ones who assume the risk. They're the ones who have to develop the knowledge of where resources need to be allocated. This is something that Per Bylund has done a great job stressing. Check out his book, The Seen, the Unseen, the Unrealized, for anybody out there who wants to learn more about that. But that's another way of understanding why entrepreneurship is so key to agorism. Because if you want to allocate resources away from the state, we know from Mises and Rothbard that you have to be an entrepreneur to do so. And also Israel Kirzner and Peter Klein and some other great economists who have done work on entrepreneurship.
So, just the final word on wage slavery, because Chomsky has certainly muddled these these waters. If you and I, money confuses people. So you and I are hanging out, and we're in the woods. You decide to chop down a tree and build yourself a canoe, and this takes you 10 hours. And then I steal the canoe. What I have essentially done, instead of offering anything in exchange or asking to borrow it, I have in effect stolen 10 hours of your life, taken it without your consent. I have in effect enslaved you. This is a concept given to us by, or given to me rather, by Robert Nozick, who was a professor at Harvard University, wrote Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So this is not just a Konkin wanting to call something slavery to make it sound bad. This is a generally understood term that to steal is to claim ownership over another person in their time and is virtually to enslave them.
Absolutely. And again, just to clarify, we don't have a problem with voluntary wage earning, right? There's going to be wage earners in a free market economy. We think there will probably be less wage earners and much more entrepreneurs in a free market because there's going to be more opportunities, right? That's what Per Byland means when he says the unrealized. But we don't have a problem with it as long as it's done in a voluntary nature. It's just the state leeches off of that, and that's where the sort of coercion enters into the agreement, and that's what we have a problem with.
And on page 38, he says, regulation is coercion. It prevents subjective value from being satisfied. So, a guy was telling me that regulation keeps us safe and how terrific it is on Twitter the other day. And I just said to him, well, from here on out, send your tweets to me, and I'm just going to tell you whether or not I approve of them or not. And I'm just regulating you. I mean, I'm not like being a jerk.
Yeah.
By the way, if I catch you not doing this, I'll put you in a cage and shoot you if you resist. Other than that, this is for your safety, and I'm just making sure you don't spread dangerous ideas, which could lead to terrible outcomes. So yes, regulation is coercion. It prevents subjective value from being satisfied. Ways of voluntary regulations: you could have credit scores in an agorist society. You could have consumer information magazines. You could have Yelp. You could have make sure that there's a free market in cell phones. So I'm terrified you're going to tell everyone if I don't give you good service, because Sal has access to a cell phone and he can tell all his friends and I can be exposed. And then one more thing on regulation, 38. Regulating agencies destroy information transfers, and regulation of quality merely certifies incompetent professionals and protects them from fraud charges. So it's not should we have perfect information or not. It's information's always imperfect. Granting a group of people called FDA or EPA or OSHA a monopoly on what information is out there and what the standards are doesn't give us better quality. It just initiates violence into the situation, again, giving us less choice, less competition, and probably worse products than we otherwise would have. Thoughts on regulation?
Again, I think you're on the money, and notice how pervasive what you just described is in so many different industries. One of the most extreme examples of this is the American Medical Association, where the U.S. requires licensure of all medical professionals, which does nothing more than constrict the supply of doctors, which drives up the cost of healthcare. That's really the primary cost. That's the primary reason why healthcare is so expensive in this country. Not the only, but one of. And the idea, and this is what Konkin's speaking about in the primer, is that licensure will prevent quackery. And I think this is funny because it's not funny really, because if you think about it, medical malpractice is one of the leading causes of death in this country. Now, one comical way to look at it that I like to tell people to make my point is go take a ride on the New Jersey Turnpike, where I'm from. Spend about a half hour riding up and down the New Jersey Turnpike and tell me that all those licensed drivers are not quacks, okay? Because 30 minutes on the New Jersey Turnpike, you can figure out very quickly that licensure does not prevent quackery very efficiently.
Exactly. Page 39. Taxation takes something from someone against his or her will and is a violation of his or her subjective values. It directs resources counter-entrepreneurially. The best way to understand that taxation is quite literally theft or extortion. As Mark Victor likes to always remind me, if taxation was voluntary, one, you'd be able to opt out. Two, anyone would be able to issue taxes. We wouldn't have Blockbuster ever go out of business. They would just issue taxes to stay in business. And I would be issuing taxes against my enemies pretty frequently if it was just a way of exchanging things. And if I don't have the right to tax, I can't delegate it to a congressman to tax on my behalf. if I don't have the right individually. Thoughts on taxation?
Well, I'm like I said, I grew up about 10 minutes from New York City, right outside Manhattan. When I was a kid in the 90s, I remember one of the big things was like the Gambinos and John Gotti. And they would come to your store and they would say, for protection services, you owe us, whatever percentage of your income for that particular time period is. And if you don't pay them, well, they're going to beat you up. And that's exactly what the government does, right? You don't have a choice. You have to accept their protection services, and you have to pay them for it, and you have to be happy about it. And if you complain, they're going to beat you up at best. The government will shoot and kill you nowadays. So the government is just the gang that has outcompeted other gangs, right? They're more successful than the Gambinos or MS-13. That's all it is. It's just they've become so successful, they've essentially established a monopoly of the red market.
You got to give them props on this great trick. We promise to murder you if you resist us. We'll confiscate your property. We take 30% annually. You don't get to opt out even if you hate the quality of the service we give you. By the way, without us, bad things would happen. And this is based off a non-existent social contract. That you almost got to step back and just say bravo to these people for pulling this trick off.
And notice how really, that people were sort of like convinced of all that nonsense, very heavily handed, until the public education system came along. Right before we had government schools, people weren't going to buy into all that nonsense. They still bought it a little bit, but not nearly as heavily as the indoctrinated slaves do today.
Page 44. I'm sorry. What is counter economics?
Counter economics. Well, Conkin defines the counter economy as really the sum total of voluntary transactions that are prohibited by the state. So counter economics is any sort of transaction that occurs in the black or gray market. So anything that abides by the non-aggression principle but is directly prohibited by the state or regulated by the state.
Now, very accomplished people will even tell me that, this is against the law. And then they'll just stop talking as if they've made some terrific Herculean point. Page 44, Samuel Conkin says, government laws have no intrinsic relationship with right and wrong or good and evil. How do you speak to someone who just arrogantly responds, that's against the law?
Well, those are the slaves, right? And I don't think it's in the primer. I think it's in the manifesto. Conkin says, don't even bother with these folks, right? Just you don't even waste your time. So you speak to the people who are already. Speak to the ANCAPs, he tells us. Speak to the anarchists and the free marketeers. They're the ones who are most susceptible to the Agorist message of counter economics. So, these people are still brainwashed. They're in sheep mode. You're not going to. You can show a horse the door to the barn, but you can't make him walk through it.
Oh, exactly. I mean, two great methods. Larkin Rose has a thing where he will literally write down on a piece of paper to tell someone to do something and then say, look, I have clearly written this down. This is an obligation on you. I've written it down. Now do it. Or Mark Passio actually got in a big fight with my grandma about this. He said, my grandma was saying, well, it's important to obey the law. You live in a society. And he goes, well, take the example of prohibition. So it was immoral for me to take a sip of alcohol and drink it on one day, but then like a couple hours went by and then it was overturned. And now it's moral for me to do this thing because of a person in DC. Like, what is it? Is it the suit? Is it the building they're in?
Right.
Is it what kind of pens are they using here? I mean, is this magic? And it more or less is just mind control. The idea that some people have the right to rule others. Page 45, he says, all non-coercive human action committed in defiance of the state constitutes the counter economy. Thoughts on laws having nothing to do with morality and defying the state in the counter economy?
No, I think you hit the nail on the head again. Obviously, right and wrong and legality are completely separate issues. One, just for further reading, I think one, not to get too philosophical on everybody, but there's like a good book by Plato. I think it's in the Republic, where Socrates has this dialogue with Thrasymachus, who makes the claim that might makes right. And if you want to hear Socrates just completely annihilate somebody, look up that dialogue. It's really a great example of why the state can't mandate what is moral and what's not.
Excellent. Page 51, he says, we want to maximize both profit and freedom. The basic law of counter economics is trade risk for profit. I think it's important. I should have written down the definition of profit from the Austrian point of view. It's simply when benefits exceed costs. So if I go to a friend's house and have a good time, I have profited from the scarce resources I employed. My time is scarce. I spent my time with them and I'm happier for it. If I go to work and earn $100, but it cost me 50 cents in gasoline to get there, I have spent 50 cents and 10 hours of my life. So, thoughts on maximizing profit and freedom and trade risk for profit?
Well, it goes back to what we were saying earlier about, looking for ways that you can minimize risk, which will ultimately lead to lower costs and lower prices for your customers and consumers. You know, more riskier counter-economic operations, you're going to have to charge higher for because they carry a larger penalty, right? So I think Conkin gives the example of, if I forget what the example he gives is, but he says something to the effect of, calculate for potential time lost and potential fees that might be imposed on you, and then add that into your costs. And then he gives a simple formula, like a mathematical calculation that you can just input your numbers into, and it will determine if you should or shouldn't act, whether or not it will or will not be beneficial to you. But risk is an important part of any sort of entrepreneurial decision, not just in counter economics. It's just now you whereas the normal entrepreneur has only to consider the risk of losing capital, the agorist has to consider the risk of both the state and the market.
Exactly. Page 55, he talks about CBR, Citizens Band Radio, where truckers communicating about speed traps after there was a 55-mile-an-hour law implemented. So they would more or less, call each other or use this radio to help each other out when the state was going to stop them from engaging in an activity that wasn't hurting anyone. Do you know of any equivalent of Citizens Band radios today?
Oh man, there's, like I said, signals is a great way to communicate. It's the only way that I recommend communicating for counter economists. And there's, like I said, as long as you're using end-to-end encryption, but signal is the best way to do it. There's also like ham radio and stuff like that, which I'm not really that well versed on, but I would recommend following people like Car Campit he's on a new podcast called The Signal, or Jack Spirko. Also, one thing I think is interesting, the example that Conkin gives about trucking is that he wrote this like back in the 80s. This is still a viable counter-economic activity that people partake in today. I've got a buddy who's a trucker, and they do this all the time. There's a weight limit that's imposed on them, and they run heavy so they can make more money. So really, in a certain sense, we're all agorists. It's just, to what degree do we realize it?
Exactly. Page 60. Consistent libertarians see no place for criminals, even to fight other criminals. Talks about voluntarily achieving justice. When trying to achieve justice, you engage in investigation, delegation of protection, arbitration, and restitution. Says all four of those can be funded voluntarily, and none of them justify the existence of a state. When someone says, well, I want a justice system that protects us, and agorism doesn't really guarantee me that. How do you respond?
Well, I mean, look around today. What we have today is the opposite of justice. So it really we can't do worse than what the current judiciary has done. We certainly wouldn't have Ross Ulbricht in jail for life, or Julian Assange and Edward Snowden on the run for exposing war crimes. So this is this is a perversion of justice, what the state is giving us. But what I think is important, the important thing to understand about agorism and what Konkin's saying, is the concept of restitution, right? Because this is a really important concept in agorism, because we don't believe in punishing people. A lot of us, myself included, and even Konkin is sort of wishy-washy on this, but Rothbard as well, we have a problem with punishment for deterrence, because it's not, if I steal $20 from you, and the cost of you not having that $20 is $5, then you've incurred a loss of $25. So you can take up to $25 from me. But as soon as you take $25.01, now you become the aggressor and I become the victim. So restitution is a really important concept, not only in agorism, but just in libertarianism in general, I think.
He has a great line on page 161. I don't know if these numbers are accurate, but it's just a clever way of explaining it. He goes, perhaps 0.01% of those calling themselves anarchists throughout history have ever used a bomb. 100% of states bomb, shell, and machine gun regularly as a matter of course. Page 62.
That's my next tweet.
Page 62, libertarianism goes back to the abolitionist movement, as we said before. What makes taxation, kidnapping, slavery, theft wrong is a violation of consent. Consent is the root of morality, along with self-ownership. Why do you think, I know he goes over this, why do you think so many people today who are, very well educated, well read all over the world see the state as a legitimate institution?
I think that they're indoctrinated. I think they're brainwashed, both from the public schooling and from mass media. Right, and the mass media is not. I don't consider them to be private. I don't consider a corporation, and I got this from Conklin. I don't consider corporations to be private because they exist by state charters. So, to me, it's a matter of them being brainwashed. And like we said before, the state didn't get away with half of this stuff until they really imposed public education on the people. It wasn't until the state had the power to school children that they were able to increase the rate of inflation or the rate of taxation or the amount of regulations and prohibitions so highly.
Yeah, I was just talking to Dave Rubin about that. I'm like, yeah, there are some terrible things, that the free market can that the free market could do. Corruption, theft, bribery. All of those apply tenfold to the state because you can't opt out of funding. So any criticism you have of voluntarily funded competition applies tenfold to the state. Eric Weinstein really showed this the other day. He was talking about, he said, look, maybe the election was stolen, maybe it wasn't. Even if there were a stolen election, we abide by the court's decision. Even if the Supreme Court is wrong, that's why it's the Supreme Court. Tough shit. Courts blunder all the time. It just ends there. In other words, the idea that you think you're so clever coming up with well, what if there's a bad ruling, or what if there's a corrupt judge, or what if someone screws me in a transaction? Look, man, I'm so sorry, and I want a society where that doesn't happen. It's why I embrace free markets and competition. The existence of a ruling class in no way stops this or guarantees this to not happen again. Page 78, he says, the goal of the Agora is a free society that is the only one in which each and every one of us can satisfy his or her subjective value without crushing others' values by violence. Page 80, the opportunities in freedom explode into the unimaginable. The sheer complexity of all possible choice moves to the infinite as restrictions approach zero. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, this is really key, I think. If you allow for the division of labor and entrepreneurs, if you allow them to create and innovate, they will. A lot of times you hear people say, well, how would you libertarians create the roads? And I say, we don't know, because only entrepreneurs can figure that out, right? Only an entrepreneur motivated by the profit motive can tell you what. Maybe they're going to create a special lane just for bumpers, for drunk drivers. Maybe they'll have sort of a track in the middle like a trolley car. We don't know because we haven't let entrepreneurs apply their creativity to these problems.
It's certainly been heavily restricted. You mentioned Walter Block earlier, who wrote the great treatise, The Privatization of Roads and Highways. Conkin says there was
one more point.
Yeah.
I'm sorry. One more point on that too, because it's interesting. We're talking about like counter economics and the blossoming of the market. Well, in terms of tokenization, we're about to experience what I think is going to be the Tocambrian explosion, and we're going to have tokens for all different sorts of things, not just securities and assets, but I think the microphone that you're using and the computer that we're recording, everything will be tokenized. So I think that as decentralization sort of enables and sort of empowers individuals, we're going to have much more of this division of labor and specialization, and I'm really excited about it. I think it's going to unleash a wave of innovation like we've never seen before.
Oh, I love it. And even when, psychos like Jack Dorsey get a hold of something as big as Twitter, you know what? Thank you for showing us how something like that can work so we can essentially copy it. MeWe
Right.
is a great platform. I love it. It's a way better Facebook, and thankfully it's excuse me, it's a nice alternative. Just as Odyssey is,
Right.
taken from YouTube, and the search functions are getting better on there every day. I can't
I'll have to
recommend that
check those
highly
out.
enough. Konkin says there is nothing the state can offer you in moral protection that the market cannot offer, and the free market will function faster and better than the state. It's true that an occasional market company may be unsound, but you will always have the option of switching to a better competitor under the state. You know your protection service will always be the same, poor with no alternative. So you can always opt out. And it's also important that in a free market, no one recognizes people to have any extra rights. So you don't get any of this, well, do what the officer says, regardless of right or wrong. You could take it up with the courts later. You have more accountability. So there's not this blank check for these badge wearers to inflict tyranny on the rest of us. He then says, page 86, government will not disappear until it is rejected by the overwhelming majority of people under its rule. Comments on protection and people losing the legitimacy of the mind of the state in their mind.
Well, I mean, look at the state of current policing, and we can see how inefficient the state is in providing protection services. Another way you could see it is by looking at the efficiency of arbitration or mediation as opposed to traditional court litigation. Right? One's very expensive, and neither party's happy. Whereas in arbitration or mediation, it's a lot cheaper because it's privatized usually, and at the end of it, both parties come to an agreement. So there's two great examples of why the state is less efficient than the market when it comes to protection services.
Even a couple
One more
times in my
point
life,
too.
yeah.
Go ahead.
I was going to say there have been a couple times in my life where someone has blatantly ripped me off. And I don't think I've ever gone, gosh, I really got to get the state involved in this to really clear things up. They just make
Right.
it worse. So I think Amazon was really good when I just didn't get something that I paid quite a bit of money for. They were good. They wanted me as a return customer. They didn't have to do it. They could have said, "We think you're a liar.
Exactly.
Goodbye." But we actually the payment went through, so we have your money. Goodbye. But excuse me, they didn't do that in a way that, and then they got the entrepreneurial idea of having the employees take pictures of deliveries. So that's a way to combat some of, maybe I was a fraudster. That's a way of combating fraud. Some people have things that are so valuable, they'll give the Amazon employee the code to their electronic lock in their house or their garage. Because, so again, more options for people to combat fraudsters and thieves. Page 101, he says the state must be defeated in each person's mind. So it's not about we got to take down the Capitol building or paint the Statue of Liberty black and yellow. It's about changing the belief inside people's minds, the root of the issue. Thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not really so keen on convincing people because I think that counter economics will provide the economic incentive for them to engage in agorism. But I understand what Konkin's saying. And really, once people realize that the state is a gang, a monopoly of thieves, that's when we're going to sort of have this awakening. But I do want to touch on that one point that you made, which is just that going back to protection services, once we break that monopoly, that's the key to the counter economy. Once we can establish a competitor to the state's monopoly on violence, that's when I think we're going to, and I think Conklin said this as well, we're going to enter the fourth and final phase of agorism. That's when we know the state is sort of in its final death throes.
Page 102. I love this because this is about liberating your mind before you engage in agorism. He talks about an agorist is one who lives counter economically without guilt. And then he says, every law that you obey must be re examined with the thought, how does it protect life and property? So you need that sort of intellectual compass in order for you to make sure that do I break the law or do I follow it, or do I do half and half like Monday through Wednesday, I follow the law. How do I do this? Well, he actually gives you some sort of tool as an introduction to the ideas of self-ownership and voluntarism. Every law that you obey must be re-examined with the thought, how does it protect life and property? Comments on that?
Well, and it really, this all stems from the non-aggression principle, right? I mean, it's a matter of being consistent, and it just goes to show you, at least, in Agorism, we believe that there's a sort of tie between logic and morality, and there it is, right? It's the application of the non-aggression principle to our behavior. That's the key for the counter-economist, or frankly, for any half-decent libertarian worth their salt, is the obedience to the non-aggression principle.
Excellent. So I'm going to list off a couple. I'm just going to list off a topic. You tell me if you know of any, semi-agorist ways. I know that everything, was touched by the state in some way, but the lesser, the better. So if I am someone who just wants to get my food agoristically through the counter economy, do you have any ideas or know of any ways to get food while engaging in agorism?
Yeah, so again, going back to local production facilities that bypass state regulations, grow your own food. And if you can, grow what you can, but trade for that which you cannot. So I just learned this myself from Curtis Stone, the urban farmer. Basically whatever fishery, there's lobster fisheries in Maine that will ship you boxes of lobster directly from their dock to your door. There's ranchers in Texas and Arkansas who will do the same. There's tropical farms in Florida that will do that for you. And if you can convince these farmers, these entrepreneurs, to accept cryptocurrency or silver coins, then we're all the better off. But the key is to sort of go directly to the entrepreneur, try to deal in cash or a very liquid form of currency that's going to enable them to sort of minimize their tax burden. And that's a great way to sort of avoid the agricultural regulations and disintermediate the FDA.
One of the things Konkin mentions in his trucker example is, the positive ramifications that came from the Citizen Band radio. And the first one he mentions is it created solidarity among the truckers. So what you're doing is you're creating sort of a, not society, but a group of people that are more or less friends, and they have this really important thing in common. The state is always trying to divide people on race, on gender, on income, on nationality, on age, or any of these other ridiculous things. And they just hate friendships where people can rely on each other because, hey, you got no one to rely on? Well, guess who? Trump's here to protect you. Obama's here to take care of you. What else do you need, really?
And that's that's such a key aspect of agorism is community, and how community is
Yes,
built by
yes.
voluntary trade and exchange.
Housing.
Well, one great example. I've got a buddy who lives in a very urban part of New Jersey, and he rents out he rents out a unit, or he owns it, and you're not allowed to sublet it. There's a certain amount of people you can have in there at a certain amount of time. I think to violate it is called stacking. Well, if you go inside this guy's apartment, he's just got boards up against the wall where he's renting out for like $50 a night. And he makes so much money that to him, he doesn't care about the occasional once a year $5,000 fine. He'll pay it because he's making so much more that it compensates for his loss. So there's a great example of how to use housing to get around zoning regulations and provide cheap, low-cost housing options for victims of the state and their regulatory coercive attitudes.
Exactly. Books.
Well, there are some banned books in this country. There's only been a couple banned books in American history. Isn't it funny that one of them is a book on economics by Irwin Schiff called Federal Mafia, where he describes how the income tax is illegal and how it's unconstitutionally collected. So, what better way of agorism than writing books that are banned by the state because you're writing the truth about their tax policies?
Internet.
One of my favorite agorists. Use Tor, use encryption. Make sure you're protecting yourself. Use a VPN. I wrote an article on the New Libertarian blog about this called OPSEC, where there's a lot of great information in there. But again, it comes down to and at the end of the day, it comes down to using end-to-end encryption.
Computers.
I would tie that into like the internet. I would probably say the same thing. I'm not sure if there's any sort of regulations based around computers, but if there are, uh, by smuggling those products, you would be engaging in gray market agorism.
Yeah, I mean, certainly the NSA will even regulate computers under the guise of, well, we want to track computers and make sure there's not terroristic activity, which kills local consumer producers because word has gotten out to other countries that
Right.
the
I see what you're saying.
government, hey, before you buy that thing, the government
Yeah.
of America is listening in, and then they just go buy somewhere else. So yeah, that's why I was looking for
You know,
a
it's
computer like
interesting that
that.
you say that because I've got a buddy who was just speaking about that, and he was telling everybody you to learn Linux and to use Linux. And I'm not like a computer expert. I'm not like a computer scientist kind of guy, so I don't really know too much about it. But I think that's sort of a DIY sort of operating system, if I understand it correctly.
Sure. And my Freedom colleague, Ernie Hancock, set me up with an IPFS, interplanetary file sharing, for a lot of my videos. I know that's one. I'm just sort of spitballing. I
Excellent.
don't know. I don't know all the details, but I know that that's been promoted.
One more example, real quick, is, and a lot of people aren't going to like this one, but you can actually put something on the BSV blockchain where it will live forever. So Bitcoin Satoshi Vision has huge blocks. So if you uploaded one of your podcast episodes to the BSV blockchain, it's sort of, they call it the metanet, right? Because it's sort of an internet on top of the internet. It's uncensorable, and anything that lives there will exist there forever as long as someone's mining BSV. So I think someone put Joe Rogan and Alex Jones's famous YouTube show on there where it will live forever now.
Oh my gosh, I got to get my hands on that. Okay, so we talked about 3D printers, which I do know the site you're talking about, which you can get through SalTheAgorist.com. How do I was looking, I think there's like 7 or 8 of them. How do I know which one is right for me?
Well, the most popular model is the V2. Then it's the newest model, the Ender 3. I can't keep them on our shelves long enough. I get 30 of them and they're gone the next day. So we're trying. But the one that I recommend for beginners is the CR6 SE. It's another $120, $30, something like that. But it's a better product for beginners because it comes basically modularized. There's only 5 pieces and 8 screws that you need to put together. It takes less than 5 minutes to assemble the entire thing. And it also has this handy little auto bed leveling feature. And really, leveling the bed, anybody who knows about 3D printing will tell you the worst part about 3D printing is leveling the bed and learning how to do that. It's sort of a pain in the butt. But the CR6 SE will do it automatically for you. The other printer that I like a lot that I've been playing with myself is the LD002R, which is a resin printer, completely different kind of 3D printing technology, but it's very cool because I can print out a Glock frame in about 10 hours in Minecraft.
Excellent. And I know that uh, I wrote down car repair just because so many car mechanics will screw you.
Yes.
That I do know a guy in Arizona. DM me on Twitter if you really want it. Take a few minutes to DM me on Twitter. Um, Come to think of it, I should have asked him before talking about this. So by the time this is up, I will have conspired with him about whether or not I could give that away. Any car mechanics?
I wrote an article a long time ago called something like 5 ways to engage the counter economy or 5 easy ways. And one of the things I wrote about was the shade tree mechanic. It's a great way to participate in counter economics because 9 out of 10 times this person is not going to report your alternator on their tax return, right? This is a purely cash transaction. The state is not involved with it. You can deny the state tax revenue by going to the shade tree mechanic rather than the formal institutionalized, registered business on the corner.
Excellent. Sal the Agorist, is there any major thing that I missed as far as getting an introduction to agorism or the ideas of Konkin in the Agorist primer?
I think we really kind of covered it. I think we sort of covered the gambit. I think the important thing if for listeners to take away, if you're going to take one thing away from the Agorist primer, it's consistency. It's the consistent application of libertarian principles will automatically and necessarily lead you to counter-economics and agorism.
Sal the Agorist, thank you for your time, brother. Check him out at saltheagorist.com. Link in the description. Take care.
Sir.